What if the very thing you've been trying to hold on to is what's keeping you trapped? What if strength isn't found in control but in letting go? You don't need more effort, you need less resistance. The moment you stop fighting life, something deeper begins to carry you. Everything changes when you surrender not to something but to nothing. You've been searching for peace in the wrong direction. There is a sacred paradox at the heart of spiritual awakening, and it is this: when you surrender to nothing, you inherit everything. The human mind struggles with this truth because it has been trained to grasp, to achieve, to secure. Yet the soul knows another way, a way of release, a way of holy emptiness. To surrender to nothing does not mean to fall into despair or passivity. It means to lay down the false burdens we have been carrying, the need to control outcomes, the hunger for recognition, the fear of loss. It is the quiet decision to stop wrestling with life and allow life to reveal its deeper order. Nothingness is not absence, it is pure space. It is the still point where personal will dissolves and a higher intelligence begins to move. When we empty ourselves of opinions, judgments, and anxious striving, we become available to wisdom that does not originate in the mind. In that sacred emptiness, truth speaks without words. Many believe surrender is defeat, but in spiritual reality, surrender is mastery. The moment you stop demanding that life conform to your plans, you discover a peace that circumstances cannot touch. You realize that you were never meant to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. There is an infinite presence that governs without strain and provides without effort. Surrendering to nothing is also surrendering the ego story, the constant narrative of me, mine, and my struggle. As that story fades, something vast and gentle takes its place. Fear loosens its grip, resistance softens. You no longer fight shadows because you have stepped into the light of awareness. In this state, action still happens, but it flows. Decisions are made, but without anxiety. Challenges arise, but they no longer define you. You learn to stand in the calm center, trusting that what needs to be done will be done through you, not by you. So today, release the burden of becoming something. Release the pressure to prove, to force, to secure. Dare to surrender to nothing and discover that in this nothingness lies fullness, guidance, and unshakable peace. When nothing remains of the false self, what remains is truth, quietly governing all. To understand why surrender is not weakness but spiritual authority, one must first unlearn the common definition of power. The world teaches that power comes from force, resistance, self-assertion, and the ability to impose one's will. From this perspective, surrender appears like defeat, like giving up one's strength or identity. Yet spiritual reality operates by an entirely different law. True authority does not arise from personal effort, but from alignment with a higher order that is already complete, intelligent, and sustaining all things. Surrender, in its spiritual sense, is the conscious release of the belief that the personal mind is the source of wisdom, safety, or control. It is the willingness to stop struggling against life and to acknowledge that there is an intelligence greater than human reasoning governing every detail of existence. This act requires courage, not weakness, because the ego survives by control and fear. Letting go of control feels threatening to the ego, but liberating to the soul. When surrender occurs, it is not strength that is lost, but false strength that is laid down. Spiritual authority emerges the moment one stops relying on personal will as the primary force of action. Personal will is limited, reactive, and shaped by past experiences, fears, and desires. It can only operate within what it knows or believes possible. Surrender opens consciousness beyond these limits. In releasing the need to manipulate outcomes, a deeper intelligence begins to function through awareness. This intelligence does not struggle or hurry, yet it is precise, timely, and effective. Authority here is quiet, not aggressive, and it does not announce itself. What appears outwardly as passivity is inwardly profound confidence. Surrender does not mean inaction. It means inspired action rather than anxious effort. When the personal sense of, I must make this happen, dissolves, action flows from clarity rather than pressure. There is no inner conflict, no divided mind pulling in opposite directions. Decisions arise naturally, and when they are carried out, they carry a certain weight and calm assurance that force could never produce. Weakness seeks validation and fears loss. Spiritual authority rests in trust and therefore cannot be shaken by changing conditions. A surrendered consciousness is not dependent on outcomes for its sense of peace. This independence is power. When nothing external can threaten your inner stability, you no longer react blindly to circumstances. You respond with discernment. This response carries authority because it is not fueled by fear or desire but by understanding. Surrender also removes the burden of self-importance. The belief that everything depends on me is one of the heaviest loads a person can carry. It leads to exhaustion, frustration, and constant tension. In surrender, this burden is released. Life is no longer seen as a personal battlefield but as a divine movement unfolding. From this realization, authority arises because one is no longer interfering with fear-based resistance. Allowing truth to operate unobstructed is far more powerful than attempting to control every outcome. Spiritual authority does not argue, defend, or dominate. It simply stands. When surrender has taken place, there is no need to convince others or prove correctness. The presence of inner certainty speaks louder than words. People sense this stability and often respond to it without knowing why. This is not charisma born of personality but influence born of alignment. The authority is not personal, yet it expresses through the individual with unmistakable clarity. Another aspect of surrender as authority is freedom from inner conflict. Most human weakness comes from division within the mind, wanting and fearing at the same time, believing and doubting simultaneously. Surrender resolves this conflict by yielding the divided mind to a higher unity. When thought no longer fights itself, energy becomes focused and effective. This focus is felt as strength, even though it originates from letting go rather than tightening grip. Surrender also dissolves resistance to what is. Resistance drains energy, acceptance restores it. When one stops resisting present circumstances, clarity emerges. This clarity allows one to see what truly needs attention and what can be released. Authority lies in discernment, not in control. Knowing when not to act is as powerful as knowing when to act, and this knowing arises naturally from surrendered awareness. Fear thrives on the illusion of separation, the belief that one stands alone against life. Surrender dissolves this illusion by revealing unity with the source of life itself. From this unity, fear loses its foundation. Without fear, choices are no longer defensive. They become creative, compassionate, and firm when necessary. Authority without fear is gentle but immovable, like a deep current beneath calm water. In surrender, identity shifts from being a personal doer to being an instrument of a greater order. This does not diminish individuality, it purifies it. What remains is authentic expression free from egoic distortion. Words spoken from this place carry weight because they are not driven by personal agenda. Silence itself becomes communicative. This is authority that does not need recognition to exist. Thus surrender is not the abandonment of strength but its refinement. It is the exchange of strained effort for effortless alignment. What the world calls weakness is, in spiritual truth, the highest form of strength, the strength that comes from knowing you are not the source, yet you are never separated from the source. Nothingness, as understood in spiritual consciousness, is not a void of despair or loss but a state beyond mental noise, personal history, and conditioned identity. The mind usually interprets nothingness as emptiness to be feared, because it equates value with accumulation of knowledge, experiences, possessions, and identity. Yet the deepest spiritual insight reveals that fullness is not achieved by adding more, but by removing what obstructs awareness of what already is. Nothingness is the clearing away of illusion, and in that clearing, divine fullness is naturally revealed. The human sense of lack is born from the belief in separation. When the mind believes itself to be an isolated entity, it seeks completion through external means. This seeking creates constant movement, effort, and dissatisfaction because no external form can satisfy an internal misunderstanding. Nothingness begins when this restless search comes to a halt, not through force, but through understanding that the self which is seeking is not incomplete in the first place. When seeking ends, space appears, and that space is not empty, it is alive with presence. Divine fullness cannot be perceived through a crowded consciousness. Thoughts, opinions, fears, and desires fill the inner field so completely that there is no room for higher awareness to register. Nothingness is the inner silence that follows the release of these mental constructs. It is not created by suppressing thought, but by seeing through its authority. When thought is no longer mistaken for reality, it naturally quiets and awareness expands without effort. In this state of nothingness, identity loosens. One is no longer defined by past experiences, personal stories, or projected futures. What remains is pure being, unburdened by labels. This beingness is not neutral or empty, it is rich, luminous, and complete. The fullness experienced here is not emotional excitement or intellectual satisfaction, but a deep sense of wholeness that does not depend on conditions. The paradox is that fullness cannot enter a consciousness that insists on being full of itself. Personal importance, fixed beliefs, and rigid self-images act as barriers. Nothingness removes these barriers. When the false sense of self steps aside, what has always been present becomes obvious. Divine fullness is not something that arrives from elsewhere. It is revealed when nothing stands in its way. Nothingness also dissolves time. The mind lives in memory and anticipation, constantly referencing the past or projecting into the future. In nothingness, these movements cease. Awareness rests in the present, which is the only point at which divine reality can be experienced. This present awareness is expansive, not confined. It carries an intelligence that does not think yet knows. This knowing is fullness itself, untouched by change. Emptiness frightens the ego because the ego exists only through content. Without stories, roles, and comparisons, it cannot survive. Yet what dies in nothingness is not the true self but a false construct. What remains is life aware of itself without division. This awareness is inherently fulfilled because it lacks nothing. It does not ask questions about its worth or purpose, it simply is. Divine fullness expresses itself through peace, clarity, and effortless order. When nothingness is embraced, life begins to flow without resistance. Solutions arise spontaneously. Insight appears without reasoning. This does not mean that challenges vanish, but that they are met from a deeper level of understanding. Fullness is experienced not as abundance of things, but as sufficiency of being. Nothingness is also freedom from comparison. The mind constantly measures itself against others, creating hierarchy and insecurity. In nothingness there is no one to compare and nothing to defend. This absence of comparison releases immense energy. The fullness that emerges is not competitive or possessive. It is shared, inclusive, and naturally generous. Silence plays a central role in revealing this fullness, not the silence of avoidance, but the silence of attentive presence. In silence, truth does not need explanation. It is recognized directly. Words may later arise to describe the experience, but the experience itself is beyond language. This wordless recognition is fullness without form, yet capable of taking form when needed. The more one rests in nothingness, the more life reveals its richness. Colors seem deeper, relationships more authentic, actions more meaningful. This is not because the world has changed, but because perception has been purified. When perception is free of mental clutter, reality shines through unobstructed. Nothingness is therefore not an end state but a living doorway. Each moment of surrender into emptiness allows fullness to express itself anew. It is an ongoing revelation rather than a fixed attainment. The doorway is always open, but it is narrow, because only what is light can pass through. What is heavy with ego, fear, and attachment cannot enter. To live from nothingness is to live without inner resistance. Life is no longer negotiated or battled. It is met directly, honestly, and openly. This openness is fullness in action, intelligence in motion, presence expressing itself without obstruction. Letting go of the ego is not an act of destruction but an act of recognition. The ego is not a solid entity, it is a collection of beliefs, memories, fears, desires, and identifications that the mind has gathered over time and labeled as From early life, this sense of self is built as a survival mechanism, useful for navigating the world, forming relationships, and functioning within society. The problem arises when this functional identity is mistaken for ultimate reality. When the ego is believed to be who we truly are, consciousness becomes confined to a narrow and fragile sense of existence. The ego thrives on separation. It defines itself by contrast, me and you, success and failure, right and wrong, worthy and unworthy. This constant comparison creates tension and restlessness. Higher consciousness, by contrast, is inclusive and unified. It does not divide life into opposing fragments. Letting go of the ego begins when one sees that this constant inner commentary, evaluation, and defense is not life itself, but a mental filter placed over life. The moment this is seen clearly, distance is created between awareness and the egoic voice. Ego is sustained by identification. Thoughts arise and the ego claims them as personal. Emotions move through the body and the ego says, "This is happening to me." Roles are assumed and the ego says, "This is who I am." Letting go does not require rejecting thoughts, emotions, or roles, but releasing the belief that they define one's being. When thoughts are observed instead of owned, their authority weakens. When emotions are felt without resistance or storytelling, they pass naturally. When roles are played without attachment, they lose their power to imprison identity. Higher consciousness is not something created by removing the ego. It is what remains when the ego no longer dominates awareness. It is already present, quietly witnessing every thought and feeling. This witnessing awareness is stable, spacious, and unthreatened by change. The ego fears dissolution because it equates letting go with annihilation, but what actually dissolves is the illusion of separation. Awareness does not disappear, it expands. The ego depends on time for its survival. It lives in memory and projection, constantly referencing the past to justify itself or imagining the future to secure itself. Higher consciousness exists only in the present. When attention is brought fully into the now, egoic patterns lose their momentum. This presence is not forced, it is natural when resistance drops. In the present moment there is no story to defend, no image to maintain, no fear to anticipate. There is simply being. Control is another pillar of ego. The ego believes safety comes from managing outcomes, people and circumstances. This belief generates anxiety because life is inherently unpredictable. Letting go of the ego involves surrendering the illusion of control and trusting the intelligence of life itself. This trust does not lead to chaos, it leads to alignment. Actions taken from higher consciousness are not impulsive or careless. They are responsive, appropriate, and rooted in clarity rather than fear. The ego is loud because it is insecure. It constantly seeks validation, agreement, and recognition. Higher consciousness is quiet because it lacks nothing. When ego loosens its grip, there is less need to speak unnecessarily to prove a point or to defend a position. Silence becomes comfortable rather than threatening. In this silence, perception sharpens. One begins to sense rather than judge, to understand rather than react. Letting go of ego also transforms relationships. Ego-based relationships are transactional, driven by need, expectation, and self-image. Higher consciousness relates without agenda. It listens without preparing a response. It sees the other not as a threat or a means to an end, but as another expression of the same life. This does not mean boundaries disappear. It means boundaries are no longer built from fear. Suffering is closely tied to egoic identification. Pain may arise naturally through loss, change, or physical limitation, but suffering arises when the ego resists what is. The ego says, "This should not be happening to me," and conflict is born. When ego is released, experience is allowed to be as it is. This allowance does not create passivity, it creates clarity. From clarity, appropriate action arises without inner struggle. Higher consciousness is characterized by effortless awareness. There is a sense of flow, as if life is moving through rather than being pushed forward. Creativity increases because the mind is no longer crowded with self-concern. Intuition becomes clearer because it is no longer drowned out by mental noise. Decisions feel simpler because they are not filtered through fear-based calculation. The ego wants to become something. Higher consciousness recognizes that becoming is unnecessary because being is already complete. When the drive to improve the self as an image relaxes, genuine growth occurs naturally. Compassion deepens, not as a moral obligation, but as a natural response to shared existence. Humility arises not as self-devaluation, but as accurate perception of one's place within a greater whole. Letting go of ego is not a one-time event but an ongoing seeing. Each moment offers the choice between contraction into identity or expansion into awareness. Each time awareness is chosen, higher consciousness becomes more accessible, more familiar, more lived. True freedom does not begin with acquiring more options, greater power, or stronger control over circumstances. It begins the moment the inner demand to control life loosens its grip. The human mind equates freedom with dominance over outcomes, believing that if events, people, and conditions can be managed, safety and satisfaction will follow. Yet this belief quietly imprisons consciousness, because life is fluid, unpredictable, and far too vast to be contained by personal will. The attempt to control what cannot be controlled creates tension, fear, and constant inner resistance. Control is rooted in fear. At its core lies the belief that without personal management, something will go wrong, something will be lost, or one's identity will be threatened. This fear fuels mental vigilance and emotional guarding. Even when circumstances appear stable, the mind remains on alert, anticipating potential disruption. This state is not freedom, it is confinement within anxiety. True freedom emerges when this fear-based stance is recognized and released. Letting go of control does not mean abandoning responsibility or becoming careless. It means relinquishing the illusion that personal effort is the source of order. There is an intelligence inherent in life that regulates growth, balance, and timing without strain. The heart beats, seasons change, wounds heal, and understanding unfolds without conscious direction. When this intelligence is trusted inwardly, the compulsion to control begins to dissolve, and with it, the inner pressure to constantly manage life. As control ends, attention returns to the present moment. Control always projects into the future, attempting to secure outcomes before they occur. In contrast, freedom resides in presence. In the present, action can be taken where action is needed, and rest can occur where rest is appropriate. There is no excess movement of the mind, no rehearsing of scenarios, no bargaining with uncertainty. This simplicity is not emptiness, it is clarity. The end of control also brings emotional release. Many emotions are not responses to reality but reactions to imagined loss or threat. When control is surrendered, these imagined threats lose credibility. Fear softens, frustration loosens, and resentment fades. Emotional energy that was once trapped in resistance becomes available for creativity, compassion, and insight. Life begins to feel less like a struggle and more like a conversation. Freedom is experienced as trust. Not blind belief, but a quiet confidence that life is not hostile, that existence is not fundamentally against you. This trust allows one to meet uncertainty without panic. Decisions are made with attentiveness rather than desperation. Mistakes are seen as part of learning rather than as personal failures. This perspective grants a resilience that control could never provide. When the need to control ends, relationships transform. Control often appears in subtle forms: expectations, unspoken demands, emotional manipulation, or the need to be right. These patterns create distance even when intentions are good. Releasing control allows others to be as they are, without constant correction or judgment. This acceptance does not weaken boundaries, it clarifies them. Boundaries formed from freedom are firm yet flexible, rooted in self-awareness rather than fear. Freedom also alters the way effort is experienced. Instead of forcing outcomes, one responds to circumstances as they arise. Action becomes responsive rather than compulsive. There is a sense of being guided rather than driven. Even effortful tasks feel lighter because they are no longer fueled by anxiety about results. Work becomes an expression of presence rather than a means of securing worth or safety. The end of control reveals an inner stillness that was previously obscured by mental noise. In this stillness, intuition becomes clearer. One begins to sense the appropriate timing of action and inaction. This discernment is subtle but reliable. It does not shout, it gently indicates. Following it feels natural, even when it leads into the unknown. Freedom is also humility. Control assumes that the personal mind knows best. Letting go acknowledges that there is more at work than individual understanding. This humility is not self-diminishment, it is realism. It recognizes the vastness of life and the limited perspective of personal experience. From this recognition comes openness to learning, to being corrected, to being changed. When control ends, identity relaxes. The self no longer needs to be protected at every turn. Criticism is no longer devastating. Praise is no longer intoxicating. One's sense of worth becomes less dependent on external validation. This stability allows for authenticity. Words and actions arise from truth rather than from the need to manage impressions. The paradox is that releasing control often results in more effective action. Without inner resistance, energy flows freely. Focus sharpens, creativity expands. Obstacles are met with adaptability rather than rigidity. What once required force now unfolds with cooperation. Life responds differently when it is no longer being opposed. Freedom, then, is not found in mastering life but in meeting it openly. It is the absence of inner compulsion, the end of constant self-management, the quiet joy of participation without domination. In this freedom, one is neither passive nor aggressive, but present, responsive, and at ease within the movement of life. Silence and stillness are not merely the absence of sound or movement. They are states of awareness in which the deeper layers of truth become accessible. Most people associate knowing with thinking and understanding with analysis, yet the most essential truths of existence cannot be reached through mental activity alone. The mind, by its nature, fragments reality into concepts and interpretations. Inner truth, however, is whole and indivisible, and it reveals itself only when the mind relaxes its constant activity. The human mind is trained to remain busy. Thoughts arise continuously, narrating experience, judging events, and predicting outcomes. This mental noise creates the illusion of control and understanding, but it also obscures direct perception. Silence begins when one stops following every thought and allows awareness to rest without direction. This silence is not forced suppression, it is the natural quiet that emerges when attention is withdrawn from compulsive thinking. Stillness complements silence. While silence refers to the quieting of mental chatter, stillness refers to the cessation of inner agitation. Even in physical inactivity, the mind can be restless, jumping from memory to desire, from fear to expectation. Stillness arises when resistance to the present moment dissolves. In this state, there is no need to escape what is happening or to alter it mentally. Experience is allowed to be exactly as it is. In silence and stillness, awareness turns inward, not toward imagination or memory, but toward direct being. This shift reveals that there is a dimension of knowing that does not depend on thought. It is immediate, intuitive, and self-evident. One does not reason toward it, one recognizes it. This recognition feels familiar, as though something long forgotten has been remembered rather than learned. Inner truth is subtle. It does not compete with the mind's noise. When the mind is active, truth remains unnoticed, not because it is absent, but because attention is elsewhere. Silence creates the space in which truth can be perceived. Just as stars become visible only when the glare of daylight fades, inner truth becomes apparent only when mental distraction subsides. Stillness also reveals the difference between the observer and the observed. In activity, thoughts and emotions feel personal and authoritative. In stillness, they are seen as movements within awareness rather than definitions of self. This seeing weakens their grip. One realizes that awareness itself is untouched by the content passing through it. This realization is not intellectual, it is experiential, and it brings a sense of stability that does not depend on circumstances. In silence, questions lose their urgency. Many questions arise from mental restlessness and the need for certainty. When stillness is present, the need to resolve everything conceptually fades. Understanding arises without answers. One simply knows what is appropriate, what is real, and what is unnecessary. This knowing is calm and unforced, unlike the tension that accompanies mental conclusions. Silence and stillness also refine perception. When the inner environment is quiet, external experience becomes clearer. Sounds are heard more distinctly, interactions are felt more deeply, and subtle emotional undercurrents are noticed without being absorbed. This heightened perception is not overwhelming, it is balanced by inner spaciousness. Awareness can hold more because it is no longer cluttered. Inner truth is not dramatic. It does not announce itself with intensity or excitement. It is simple, direct, and unmistakable once recognized. Silence allows this simplicity to be felt. One begins to sense what is essential and what is superficial, what arises from fear and what arises from clarity. This discernment does not require effort. It emerges naturally from quiet awareness. Stillness also dissolves the habit of reaction. When the mind is quiet, there is a pause between stimulus and response. In this pause, freedom exists. One is no longer compelled to react based on conditioning. Responses arise from understanding rather than habit. This responsiveness is aligned with inner truth because it is not distorted by fear or desire. Many seek truth through accumulation of teachings, techniques, or experiences. While these may point in the right direction, they can also become distractions if they reinforce mental activity. Silence requires nothing to be added. It asks only for attention to be withdrawn from unnecessary movement. In this simplicity, truth is not constructed but revealed. Stillness reveals that inner truth is not personal. It does not belong to an individual identity. It is universal, the same awareness looking through different forms. This recognition dissolves isolation. One no longer feels separate from life but intimately connected to it. Compassion arises naturally, not as a moral obligation but as a recognition of shared being. Silence also brings humility. In quiet awareness, the limitations of thought are clearly seen. One realizes how little the mind truly knows and how much it assumes. This humility is freeing. It opens the door to deeper listening, both inwardly and outwardly. Listening becomes more important than speaking, and presence becomes more valuable than opinion. As silence and stillness deepen, trust develops. One learns to trust what is perceived directly rather than what is imagined or feared. This trust stabilizes awareness. Even in movement and activity, an underlying stillness remains. Life continues, but it is no longer chaotic internally. There is a sense of being anchored in something unchanging amid constant change. Inner truth, once glimpsed in silence, continues to inform daily life. It shapes perception, action, and relationship without effort. Silence and stillness are no longer seen as special states but as the natural background of being, always available beneath the surface of experience. Trust in the unseen arises when the mind reaches the limits of what it can measure, predict, and secure. The unseen refers not to something mystical and distant, but to the deeper order of life that operates beyond sensory evidence and mental calculation. Human anxiety is largely produced by the insistence that only what is visible, provable, or controllable can be trusted. This insistence creates inattention because life itself is far larger than what the mind can grasp. Peace becomes possible only when this tension relaxes. The need to see before trusting is rooted in fear. The mind seeks guarantees because it believes safety lies in certainty. Yet certainty is fragile because circumstances change and plans fail. Trust in the unseen does not deny practical responsibility, but it releases the demand for absolute assurance. This release removes a constant background stress that most people accept as normal. When trust replaces vigilance, the nervous system settles, and the mind no longer scans endlessly for threats. The unseen is already trusted more than is recognized. Every breath depends on processes that are not consciously managed. The heart beats without permission. Growth, healing, and understanding unfold without deliberate control. Life functions through invisible intelligence long before thought intervenes. Recognizing this fact shifts trust away from personal effort toward the deeper movement already sustaining existence. Lasting peace does not come from arranging life perfectly, because perfection is a moving target. It comes from resting in the knowledge that one is not alone in managing existence. When trust in the unseen is present, uncertainty no longer feels hostile. The unknown becomes a space of possibility rather than danger. This shift does not eliminate challenges, but it changes one's relationship to them. Trust quiets the imagination. Much mental suffering is generated not by present conditions but by imagined futures. The mind rehearses loss, failure, and rejection in an attempt to prepare, but this preparation rarely prevents pain. Instead, it multiplies it. Trust interrupts this cycle by withdrawing belief from imagined outcomes. Attention returns to what is actually happening, which is usually far more manageable than what is feared. Peace rooted in trust is not emotional numbness. It is sensitivity without overwhelm. One still feels sadness, joy, disappointment, and hope, but these experiences move through awareness without destabilizing it. There is an underlying steadiness that remains even when emotions fluctuate. This steadiness is not produced by effort. It is revealed when resistance to uncertainty dissolves. Trust in the unseen also reshapes decision-making. Instead of acting from desperation or fear of missing control, actions arise from clarity and timing. There is a sense of being guided rather than pushed. This guidance is not dramatic or prophetic. It is subtle and practical. One feels when to act and when to wait, when to speak and when to remain silent. Acting from this space feels aligned, even when outcomes are uncertain. Many struggle with trust because they equate it with passivity. In truth, distrust often leads to paralysis, while trust enables movement. When one trusts the unseen, energy is no longer consumed by constant self-protection. That energy becomes available for creativity, service, and learning. Action taken from trust is firm but flexible, committed but not rigid. Lasting peace requires relinquishing the belief that peace depends on conditions. As long as peace is postponed until everything is resolved, it remains unreachable. Trust allows peace to exist alongside unresolved situations. This does not mean indifference, it means engagement without inner collapse. One can care deeply without being consumed by worry. Trust also softens the sense of personal burden. Many carry the weight of believing they must hold everything together. This belief leads to exhaustion and quiet despair. Trust redistributes this weight. It acknowledges that while effort has its place, it is not the ultimate force governing outcomes. This acknowledgement brings relief, not irresponsibility. The unseen cannot be controlled, but it can be aligned with. Alignment occurs through openness, honesty, and willingness rather than force. When motives are clear and intentions sincere, life responds in ways that may not match expectations but serve deeper understanding. Trust allows one to accept these responses without bitterness or resistance. Peace that comes from trust is durable because it is not dependent on success or failure. External results may fluctuate, but inner stability remains. This stability does not harden the heart, it opens it. Compassion deepens because one no longer views life as a battlefield. Others are seen not as obstacles or threats, but as fellow participants in uncertainty. Trust also changes how loss is experienced. Loss still hurts, but it is not interpreted as evidence of abandonment or meaninglessness. There is an understanding that endings are part of a larger movement not immediately visible. This understanding does not remove grief, but it prevents despair from taking root. The unseen cannot be proven to the mind's satisfaction, which is why trust is transformative. It moves awareness beyond dependence on mental certainty into a direct relationship with life itself. This relationship is experiential rather than conceptual. Over time, trust is strengthened not by argument but by lived recognition that peace is present even when answers are absent. As trust deepens, the need to control others diminishes. Expectations loosen. Forgiveness becomes easier, not as a moral duty, but as a natural outcome of seeing that everyone is navigating uncertainty. This shared vulnerability creates connection rather than separation. Lasting peace is not an achievement but a condition revealed when inner resistance ends. Trust in the unseen is the quiet acceptance that life is larger than understanding, yet fundamentally supportive of awareness itself. This acceptance removes the inner struggle against what cannot be known, allowing peace to remain even as life continues to unfold unpredictably. What these truths ultimately point to is a radical shift from striving to being, from control to trust, from ego to awareness. Surrender is revealed not as loss but as return to a natural state where life is no longer resisted, managed, or feared. In letting go of false strength, emptiness, ego, control, and noise, what remains is not nothingness in the human sense, but a living presence that is steady, intelligent, and sufficient. Silence becomes guidance, stillness becomes clarity, and trust becomes peace. Life is no longer approached as a problem to be solved, but as a movement to be lived from within. When this understanding settles, effort softens, fear loosens, and identity relaxes into something vast and gentle. Action continues, responsibility remains, but the inner struggle ends. One no longer seeks fulfillment through becoming, because fulfillment is recognized as already present in awareness itself. This is the quiet freedom of surrender, where nothing is grasped, nothing is resisted, and yet everything necessary unfolds with order and grace.